Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar, Calming Tantrums. Thank you so much for joining us today. I see a couple of you here ready to learn about how to deal with tantrums, how to lead to calming tantrums. And I want to kick off just with a little story to sort of set the tone here. I'm gonna share with you some of the strategies and techniques that I've learned over the past over 20 years of working with hundreds of families directly in their homes. And one of the things I want to assure you is I have been through many tantrums, and tantrums that range from what we might call a little whine, a child that's kind of whining and fussing, to full blown tantrums where I have had large pieces of furniture thrown at me. I have had my hair, when I used to have hair pulled very strongly, I have had nails dug into me. I thought I'd have quite a large scar on my cheek here from one 3-year-old's nails, and I've had all sorts of other things. And from experiencing the range of tantrums, I've discovered 3 main ways that I now approach a child who is having big emotions, who's struggling to communicate, who is feeling frustrated. 3 main strategies that, when combined and put together, really can make quite a difference. Now, I'll tell you up front, there's no single magic trick or magic bullet or one thing that you can do to disappear tantrums, because after all, you'll agree that human emotions and expressing them and feeling frustrated and angry at times is natural. It's absolutely totally to be expected from children with autism especially, because there's communication challenges and leads to frustrations. But there are things that you can do to help you manage and get through and make tantrums a little bit more calm. But I want to share this story with you. It was many years ago. I was working with a little boy, and we were in a room together, a therapy room. And so this door, the therapy room was closed so that we could focus. And his parents weren't around at this time. They were in another session. And this boy was really missing his mommy and daddy, and he was crying a lot. And it worked up into a tantrum. And the tantrum, there's some toys that were thrown, a couple right at me, especially because I wasn't producing mom and dad. And he said, I want to see my mom. And he felt that I was the keeper of the key of the door. And so he was, sort of mad at me. And there's a pretty big tantrum. And during this time, I was, trying to do my best to distract him. Actually, I was saying, "Hey, you know what? There's some toys over here in this bin that we can get, and some toys on the shelf that we could get together. And hey, look at this." And I was also trying to be funny and playful. And the more that I did this, the more that he would just focus on the door that was closed and trying to get out of that door and crying and screaming for his mom and dad. And after trying a whole bunch of different techniques that I'd learned before, something just occurred to me, and I just shifted. Something shifted in me, and I got just more relaxed. I took a breath, I got more relaxed, and I decided to go right into the storm, if you will. Instead of trying to distract him away from thinking about his mom and dad or trying to be myself fun and get him involved in a game, I thought, what if I just really leaned into what he was wanting and really understood and shared my compassion? So I got down close to him, even though he had been throwing things at me, but protected myself. And I said to him, Hey, I have a mommy and a daddy. And sometimes I miss my mom and dad too. And this little boy who had been tantruming and crying looked at me really directly and listened for the first time in about 20 minutes. He just looked at me. Like it had occurred to him, what? You have a mom and a dad and you miss them too? And I said, and sometimes I feel sad when they're not with me. I understand. And just that moment of understanding, that moment of connection, that moment of rapport allowed a space in which he didn't stop tantruming, he didn't stop crying, but he did listen a little bit. And it allowed for a space for me to reach out my hand and just touch his knee a little bit because he was down on the ground, and then rub his shoulders a little bit, just to make a connection, to say, hey, I get you. I understand you're upset, and I'm here. And the next thing I said that came just occurred to me is I said, hey, I want to help you to try and see your mom and dad. And this door is in the way, isn't it? And he kind of looked at me like, obviously I had changed, I had shifted, but looked at me like, maybe you're my friend. And here's what happened. Over the next almost 30 minutes, we worked together to try and get this door open. Now, of course, you and I know that as the adult, I could have opened it. There was a lock at the top. And I think he probably knew that too. But we had so much fun trying to get this door open. And I became, I think, his best friend for this 30 minutes. So we did things like we made a human chain, and I put my hand on the doorknob and I'd pull it and it'd fly off. And he thought that was pretty funny and he'd want me to do it again. And he thought it was so funny that he became less focused on trying to get the door open and more focused on seeing me fly backwards across the room and stumble. And he started to giggle, and the tears turned into giggling. And then we got one of the puppets or the stuffed animals off of the toy shelf, and that we added that toy into our chain, our human chain. So I held the door, and then I held the puppet's hand. He held the other puppet's hand, the puppet's other hand, and we, like a chain, we pulled on it, and then we'd all fall down together, and we giggled. And we made ropes that we tied onto the door, and we did all sorts of things for half an hour to try and get it open. And at one point when we were laughing, and at one point when we had fallen down together and we were sort of close to each other, and he was a bit calmer, I said to him, hey, if your mom and dad were here, if your mommy was here, what would you play? What would you want? And he said to me, it was so sweet and charming. He said, a hug. That's what he wanted. He wanted a hug from his mom. And he had been crying and tantruming. He wanted a hug from his mom. And I said, hey, I like hugs from my mom and dad too. And you know what? I just remembered your mom gave me a hug to give to you. And he looked at me. And again, he wasn't tantruming at this time. And being the silly Billy that I am sometimes, I reached into my pocket, pretending to pull out a hug. And I said, I got the hug right here. Can I give you the hug? And he looked at me, and I reached out with my arms, and he leaned in, and I gave him a little hug. And I said, that's from your mom. And you can have a hug from me if you want. You can ask, and we can have a little hug if that'll make you feel better. And that really shifted a whole dynamic between us. So there's a couple of ideas in there that we're going to now talk about. I want to share with you when we think about tantruming and some of the strategies that can come out of that little anecdote. It's one of many, many, many that I can share with you. A starting point for the conversation will just be for you listening today to think about what your common reaction is to tantrums. And the first place in the training that I do with professionals, therapists, teachers, educators, and parents, the starting point is always to ask ourselves, how do I feel when my child is crying, screaming, tantruming? What's the feelings that that evokes for me? So take a minute. If you have a pen and paper, you could jot down just a couple of quick ideas. For you, it might be sadness. It might be frustration with your child. It might be feeling frustrated with yourself that you're not able to calm your child down. Some parents have told me that they feel almost a panic or anxiety because they feel they've got to calm their child down. That's their sort of purpose. Of course, you want your child to be calm. but it evokes a bit of a panic. And some parents will say, I feel okay. I know that my child's going to be okay. They're upset, but I can walk them through it. So there's a real range. But for you to think about what feelings and emotions does when your child is crying and tantruming, whether it's logical or reasonable or not, but what does it evoke in you? And it's a really important starting point because it turns out that your attitude or what you're feeling, your emotions, impacts how you behave. This is actually the first principle of the intensive multi-treatment intervention program that I've directed for the past 15 years. I'll say it again. Attitude impacts behavior. So that's just a way of saying that when you're feeling angry, then your behavior is going to look and sound angry, right? I mean, that's kind of obvious. And if you're feeling playful, you're emotionally playful. If you're feeling lighthearted, if you're feeling funny or happy, then people are going to be able to see that in your voice tone. They're going to hear it in your voice tone. They're going to see it on your face. So your attitude impacts your behavior. And therefore, if your child is upset and tantruming, and if that triggers in you a panic or a deep concern that's uncomfortable, then now you have an upset child and an uncomfortable parent, and they're going to pick up on that. They're going to, not pick up on it sort of intuitively, but I mean, really, they'll hear it in your voice, they'll see it in your behavior, on your face, in your body. And that's not a helpful way to help your child to learn how to self-soothe or to self-regulate or to calm down, right? We don't need to sort of judge yourself or blame yourself, but just to say, oh, okay, yeah. So maybe one of the first strategic steps for me would be to figure out how I could be a little bit more comfortable when my child is feeling upset, even at a really high level. So just think about that. How could I become more comfortable if my child is upset? It might almost sound like an opposite kind of thing, like almost not natural. I've certainly heard parents respond to this to say, hey, Jonathan, what do you mean? How can I be comfortable if my child is upset? That doesn't feel natural. Of course I'm concerned. And yes, of course you're concerned. Of course you want to make sure that your child is comfortable. But as an adult and as a thinking adult, I promise you that there are ways that you can show you're caring, ways that you can show your love, ways that you can take action and still stay more emotionally comfortable, less panicked. And that by doing that, by taking action to help your child, but not in a panic way, not in a rush way, not in a way that adds more upset to the situation, that you will be able to help your child feel more calm faster. Does that make sense? So if I bring calm to a situation where there's upset, then that situation can be more calm. If I bring my own panic, my own concern, my own frustration to a situation that is already upset, then I'm adding some emotion to that. Does that make sense? So I want to start with a conclusion. Start with a conclusion and give you right up front the ideas that I want to present. I just want to present three ideas. So we have a limited time today. And these three ideas are probably not brand new for most people listening. However, you got to practice them. And if you put them together, they really, really can make a significant impact. I promise you, I've done this for years with hundreds of different children, age ranges from 16 months. I remember working with a little girl who was 16 months old and she was failure to thrive. We were helping her learn how to take food into her mouth. And she very much tantrumed at different times. And I experienced a very, very intense tantrum with a 21-year-old young man who was much larger and bigger and stronger than me. And that was a whole different situation. And these strategies I'm sharing with you, they really work. They really, really work. But they do take some practice. So take some notes and think about how they're going to work for you. I'm going to go through each of these three right now, but just really quickly, the idea is, and this might seem really obvious to those of you who are here to say, how can I help my child when they're in the tantrum? And the first number one thing is, well, can you prevent it? Are there steps that you might not have thought about that can reduce the number of tantrums and crying and whining that you experience in a day? So most families that I work with will be able to say, Jonathan, we experience two tantrums a day on average, or it's usually once a week there's a big blowout. Or for some families, it's about once an hour we have some kind of a whining, tantruming upset. So in other words, there's some kind of baseline or regularity for most children. And if you're a parent or a professional listening now, think about a child that either you work with or your own child and what that kind of regularity is. And what I want to propose is I'm going to share with you in a minute a couple of ideas on how you could either prevent or eliminate some of those. And imagine if we could reduce those together down by 25% less. Or imagine if it was 50% less, if you could experience half of those, and if your child was upset only half of the time, that would be really, really significant. So this is an idea that we can get to. I'm not suggesting that we can prevent and eliminate all tantrums and upset, because again, it's natural for a child to be feeling certain ways. But if we could reduce them by 50%, wouldn't that be awesome? So that's the first idea. The second is, how could we promote other ways for your child to communicate or get what they want when they're not getting what they want? So it's, again, how could I switch them into a different way of showing me that they're frustrated or upset? So we'll get into that. And the third one is kind of what I started with in the first example, is when I switched in that example with that boy who wanted a hug from his mom, or I found out that he wanted a hug, and I switched to being a little bit more calm, and I actually went into the situation rather than tried to get away from it or distract it. Really, some wonderful things came out of that. So let's dive into some of these ideas right now. The first one is about eliminating and preventing, right? So you can ask yourself how you've gone about doing this in the past. I'm going to share with you some ideas that have worked. And what I want to say is that oftentimes parents will try to avoid tantrums. Right? You might have tried to prevent them and avoid them, but by giving in or giving your child most of what they want, by avoiding the battles, right? And some of you are probably nodding, saying, yes, that's exactly what I do. I try and avoid these battles. I try and avoid the tantrums a lot. And to do that, I have to often give in or concede or anticipate what my child wants and give it to them. And and I think that this is problematic long term, because ultimately then your child becomes dependent on you predicting what they need and want, right? And so that might inhibit their language and communication development. But also, and you know this already, that it doesn't help your child to grow more resilient to be able to handle when they can't get what they want. That's really a big issue with a lot of children who we work with, which is they've been, in some ways, I'm going to say, protected or catered to some degree, to avoid that upset, to make their lives easier. So you're doing it for a good reason, but it might lead to your child not being able to handle when they can't have that thing. So, for example, I remember a child who liked to watch a certain video over and over and over. And this is many, many years ago when there were uh, VHS tapes. I mean, this is a long time ago, but it's a relevant story. And this child would you put it in the VCR in this machine, and he'd watch this video, this cartoon video, and the parents, this is a family in New Jersey I worked with years ago. The parents had experienced a couple of times when because the child watched this tape so many times, forward, backwards, it would break. The actual tape would break. And then there would be this massive tantrum until they would get in the car, race to a store. Hopefully, it was at a time when one was open, buy another copy, come home, put it in, and he was instantly calm. Some of you can relate to this, right? Maybe you're out of stock on chicken McNuggets, or you don't have enough peanut butter left, and your child throws a big tantrum, and so you race out and get more. And so they would keep extra copies of this tape that he liked, this cartoon tape, in their house so that they would avoid that. And of course, they were doing the best they can. But what it meant is that this child literally didn't learn how to handle a situation when he couldn't get what he wanted. He didn't get to work through that tantrum. And the fact that sometimes we don't have any chicken nuggets, or sometimes we're out of peanut butter, or sometimes we don't have the TV to work. Sometimes it's broken. And how do you manage that? So I don't think that trying to give your kid what they want and predict all the time is the best way to help them grow and mature and for them to manage life, because we can't, as parents, control all of life. We can only control some things, right? So at some point, your child's going to bump into life happening. And so there's a couple of other two ideas here. I'll just get into them quickly that you can do that don't prevent your kid from growing and becoming strong, but they do help you reduce tantrums. And here's the first one. The first one is to eliminate what we call hotspots. And hotspots are just times where you have to struggle or fight with your kid. So I'll give you a quick example. Let's say your child frequently goes over and touches a glass vase that you have. Maybe it's a precious heirloom in your family, or they frequently go over and they sit on a particular chair that you don't want them to sit in because it's an expensive one, or one that you don't want them to get dirty. And with a lot of children we work with, we would just say to the family, hey, if it's possible to simply put that away for a couple of months, we would recommend that you do that. Take the vase, put it in a box, put it in your garage just for a couple months. Get a big blanket, put it over that chair so they can still sit in it, but you don't have to worry about them getting it dirty. And so you sort of eliminate the hotspot. You eliminate you having to say every day, hey, what did I tell you? Hey, get down off of there. Don't touch that. And we're eliminating those struggles, not so that they can't learn to grow and learn boundaries, but just for a time so that we can build better rapport. Okay. A lot of kids who are doing a lot of tantruming are feeling controlled, and it's not fun for you as a parent. It just doesn't feel good. So, depending on where your child is on the autism spectrum, depending on how old they are, how high functioning they are, how much they can understand your directions, you may or may not eliminate more or less hotspots, right? Because there's definitely a time in development for some older children who just have to learn you can't touch that. Please don't touch that. And they have to learn that self control and regulation. So you decide as a parent, if there are hotspots that you can eliminate, where you daily get into a struggle that always results in a tantrum. And if you could eliminate it for a month or two, what this is going to do is buy you some time where there's less struggle, where there's less tantrums, and you've just eliminated for now those issues, and buy yourself some time and space to build better rapport, better compliance, better collaboration, better communication as you work through different strategies and therapies. And I'm actually later on, before we end this webinar, I want to share with you a very exciting tool that you might like to use to help with building rapport and help with increasing communication right in your own home. So I'm going to tell you about a great opportunity a little bit later. Okay, let's get into the second one. Prevent moodiness through more frequent body breaks, a healthy diet, and more play, less devices. So I'm just reading kind of right off what it says on the screen here. There's basically this idea is there's a lot of research that has shown that moodiness, or feeling upset, frustrated, our ability to handle stress, is shifted or can be impacted by diet and exercise and sleep. Okay. And you probably know this as an adult that if you don't get enough sleep, you might be more irritable the next day. Or if you're not eating right, and it might lead to constipation or bloated stomach or feeling lethargic. Again, you're less social, you're less able to handle stress, you're more irritable. And if we're just working as adults and we don't get some time to play, we feel a bit exhausted. And again, we might be a little bit more on edge and grumpy. And this is no different for a 2-year-old. Research has shown that 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, 5-year-old children's emotional regulation is improved by regular physical activity, by improved clean diets, nutritious diets, and by getting enough hydration, so water and sleep. So these are all very obvious and fairly common things to talk about. And yet, when we talk about autistic children, particularly, and having tantrums and whining, I think that because the child has been diagnosed with autism, oftentimes professionals, medical doctors, even parents will sort of discount the tantrum by saying, oh, it's because he has autism, or it's because he can't understand, or it's because he has struggled talking and communicating. But we find in our programs and what we teach is we can actually improve the emotional regulation of children by really simple things like increasing body breaks. That means increasing activity throughout the day, physical activity. Get them off the couch and say, hey guys, we're only going to do 30 minutes of TV today instead of 2 hours after school. And instead of TV, we're going to get outside and go for a big walk around the block, or go to the park on the slide, or ride our bike or our skateboard, or go for a swim in the pool, or jump on the trampoline, or play a really good tickle game that gets you breathing hard and giggling so you can almost you have bright red cheeks and you feel almost exhausted from the tickling. So there's many, many activities you can do, but all about getting that body break and oxygenation. And you're going to find overall that struggles and tantrums and whininess improves and is reduced. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the second point that we said are the 3 points we're talking today. And this is to promote alternate communication. Now, of course, children along the autism spectrum who have a diagnosis, as part of that, all of the children who I work with and young adults have a communication challenge to some degree. And it might be that they simply can't communicate verbally at all. And so they might be using an alternative communication device like an iPad, or a communication device like Proloquo to Go or something like that. Or your child may be able to talk, may be able to express words, but isn't really great at expressing always what they need or their emotions. Either way, what I want to share with you here is this idea, is that regardless of the level of communication of your child, if you're listening to this webinar and if you're here and you want to learn about how to deal with tension and how to get more calmness, there's a dynamic that is probably a card that you want to be aware of, and it's this. You want to check out and see, has whining and crying, has your child's whining and crying become form of communication? Okay, so I want to pause here and just break it down for you. There is whining and crying that happens, or crying or expressing emotion, when there's, I'm going to say, a real or legitimate fear or threat. So here's an example. Your child is running in the backyard and they fall down all of a sudden and might maybe bump their knee, or get on the dirt a little bit, and they're sort of a bit shocked because they fell down and they cry. And that's normal and natural. Nature has programmed that inside humans so that when we get hurt, we can let out a scream or a yell, let out the emotion and shock, but also to get attention so that our mom and dad or someone will come and help us. I know that's not what we're talking about here. That's not what we're calling a tantrum. So in that case, that's, I'm going to say, kind of natural to do that. But if you're walking down the road and your child had a great breakfast, they're fed, you're on the way to school, and they're warm, they have clothes on their body, they have shoes on their feet, You're maybe holding their hand, you've sung them a song or read them a book, they feel loved. So in other words, their basic needs are cared for. They're fed, they're clothed, they're loved. And you pass a toy store and they see a really big, huge box of Star Wars Lego or some kind of Lego, and they say, I want that, or can we get that? Or they're pointing at it if they're nonverbal. And you either say to them, hey, we got to get to school, it's not time to get that, or you say you already have one, or however you respond, and they start to tug on your hand and they start to whine. And you say, sweetheart, we got to go to school. Come on, we got to get, we can't stop right now. And then they sit down or they start to tantrum. And in this case, it's different than bumping your knee. It's different than being scared because there's a dog. In this case, they're fed, they're loved, they're clothed, but they just want the Star Wars Lego. And that's a different level of communication, right? In this case, you don't need to react and respond so quickly because you're seeing, oh, okay, hold on. They're using crying and whining to kind of manipulate me or to get what they want. And this is what we talk about when we say that we don't want to pay attention to or give into or reinforce this kind of whining and crying when a child is trying to get something and you already know that their basic needs are met. Okay. So on the screen here, one of the things it says is that it's a statement that I want you to write down and think about. It says, I respond faster and smarter to non-tantrum communication. Okay. I respond faster and smarter to non-tantrum communication. So that means that if my child is whining and crying for something, I'm going to be a little bit more dumb and I'm going to respond a little bit more slowly. So they're pointing and whining and pointing at something and say, oh, did you want something? What is it, sweetheart? I want to help you, but I'm not really clear. Can you use your words if they speak? Can you show me without whining? I want to help you. So you always let them know, I want to help you. I'm listening, but you're whining, you're crying. It's unclear. I need you to sort of self regulate in some way. So I'm being gentle, I'm being loving, but I'm asking for the child to find a different way, an alternate communication that doesn't include whining and crying. Again, if a child hit their knee or they bumped their head or they got shocked all of a sudden because a dog was barking, that's not the time to say, hey, I don't understand what you're saying. Can you be calm? That's a time to give them comfort. But for most of you listening today, when you think about the whining and the tantruming, you're thinking again of times when they can't get their ice cream, they want Lego, or they want to stay up later, or they got mad because you turn off the TV. And it's in these cases that you want to act a bit more dumb and move a little bit more slowly. And you're doing what we call in behavioral science differential reinforcement. Differential reinforcement. That means I'm going to reinforce, I'm going to respond faster to communications that I want to promote more of. And I'm going to move slower and respond slower to kinds of communication that I want less of. So if you want less tantrums, then don't respond so fast. Don't come running. Don't try and distract them with a puppet. Don't try and solve their problem so quickly. Yes, the tantrum will last longer. You're right, because you're not solving the problem, but you're not reinforcing it. You're giving it less attention. Does that make sense? So you might have to hear crying longer, but ultimately they're going to learn, wow, dad wasn't moving so fast. He seems a little bit more dumb. He can't really figure out when I'm crying, but when I use my words or when I just point or when I take his hand and show him, he moves faster and seems smarter and can figure stuff out. So this is differential reinforcement to the alternate kinds of communication. Does that make sense? Okay. I want to go on to the third point, and then I'm going to come back for a moment before we wrap up and share what we call the extinction burst. Okay. The third point out of the 3 points that we want to talk about is a saying that probably many of you have heard, stay calm and carry on. This came out of England, I believe. I remember seeing T-shirts with stay calm and carry on them. And I really like this idea to apply to tantrums because there's two really important parts to it. The first one is the stay calm part, and we've talked about that, right? And we talked about how, to the extent that you as the adult can stay more calm when your child is yelling or tantruming, that's the extent to which you will bring calm to their tantrum. And that's the extent to which you'll behave more calmly. You'll talk more calmly, you'll act more calmly. And it's also, by the way, the extent to which you'll have smarter ideas. You'll be more creative in how to work through this. You won't panic and just reach for giving them what they want right away and giving in and reinforcing the tantrum. You'll be smarter by staying calm. So, how do you stay calm? I'll get to the second part, carry on in just a minute, but what are some strategies to stay calm? Because it's just easy for me to say, "Hey, just stay calm." And some of you are thinking, "Hey, Jonathan, you come to my house and try to stay calm when my kid tantrums." And again, I have very much worked with hundreds of kids in tantrums and whining, and have myself had to work through staying calm. But I want to share with you a couple of things that I do and teach my team to do in these cases. And the first one is actually exactly what we just talked about: is to reframe that this child isn't hurt. Okay, it's the same reframing and remind. You remind yourself and you reframe the situation by reminding yourself that they're fed, they're loved, they're safe. So I don't need to be anything but calm. If you're looking out the window and you see your child fall from the slide and they start to cry, you don't know if they're okay. You don't know if they're safe. So you race out the door and you run there, and you might be a bit panicked, and you go and you make sure that they're okay. But again, if you're walking to school and you're holding their hand and you know they're safe and you know they're loved and you know they're fed, and they're crying because they didn't get something from you, that's sort of an extra thing that they don't need to survive, so to speak. They didn't get to put on their favorite socks today, and they're still upset 20 minutes later. Reframe it for yourself. I don't need to stop this child from crying. That's not my goal. It's not my goal to try and make them feel more comfortable right now by giving in or by talking them about it or by promising they can wear their socks tomorrow. That's not your goal. If you think that your goal when your kid is tantruming is to stop them from tantruming, then you will reinforce the tantrum. Why? Because you'll give them things and do things to appease them, and they'll learn, oh, when I yell, when I tantrum, when I stomp my feet, it works. I get what I want ultimately. And sometimes I have to scream for a long time or louder, right? I don't know if you can see the picture on the screen here where this little girl has a megaphone and the dad's doing his best to ignore her. And I want to talk about ignoring in just a second. But the idea is, just because your kid gets louder or it goes on longer, that's not the time to give in. Okay. So reframe in your mind, remind yourself and reframe the situation from, my goal isn't to get my child to stop tantruming. My goal is to show them that tantruming doesn't work with me, but I care about them and I want their best interest. And then I remind myself, is my child okay? Are they safe? Are they fed? Are they loved? Yes. Okay. I don't need to engage in this so quickly. All right. The third point is just to literally to physically relax, just to make sure that your shoulders are dropped. If right now, as you're watching this webinar, drop your shoulders a little bit, let them relax. Right now, as you're watching this webinar, see if you're holding your jaw tight. And if you are, just kind of relax it for a second. And then take a deep breath. I don't mean like a big yoga deep breath, but just let yourself breathe consciously, just like that. And just dropping your shoulders, letting your jaw relax, taking a breath gets my body just a little bit more relaxed in the moment. This is really important. We talked about why. The fourth point is to resist giving in. So even if I've reminded myself my child's okay, I don't have to respond. Even if I'm relaxed, when I'm listening to tantrum for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, or if I'm at the 1 hour mark, it's easy to give in. It's easy to just fix the situation so the tantrum stops. And when I do that, I have unfortunately once again reinforced that whining or tantruming is a communication system that works with me. So resist giving in. And then the final point here in how to stay calm is be ready to reinforce when your child does start to change. So if your child at some point calms down to even 50%, 30, 40% less whining, and you can hear that kind of breathing when they're starting to come down the other side of the tantrum. And if they, through that whimper, if they're able to say, I want a hug, or um, something like that, be ready, to reinforce it. That, hey, you know what? I heard that much more clearly. Thank you for using your words, or thank you for showing me. Yeah, of course I'll give you a hug. Sure, you know what? Maybe we could do that tomorrow. But they're not using whining and crying anymore. So again, that idea of differential reinforcement, it's one thing to ignore or to not pay attention to whining and crying when you know your kid is loved, safe, and fed. But it's another, you've got to be ready on the other side to very quickly reinforce the good kinds of communication and non-whining tantrum that you want. So those: reframe, remind, relax, resist, and ready. You don't have to memorize those. They're pretty obvious things, but if you put these together, they really, really work. Okay? All right. I'm just going to share with you then what we call the extinction burst. And this is something you got to know. I wanted to share this with you because in the past, when we've taught these ideas, and parents go away and they say, great, okay, I'm going to stay more calm. I'm going to resist giving in. The tantrums I'm going to differentially reinforce the tantrums to other kinds of communication. I'm going to get rid of hot spots. I'm going to have less fighting. I'm going to try and do some prevention. One of the outcomes that frequently happens is that it gets worse before it gets better. So it's very common that I'll get a phone call, oftentimes within a day or two. Hey, Jonathan, I'm doing some of these strategies you said, and my kid is tantruming longer than ever. What the heck are you telling us to do here? And the answer is very simple. Behavioral science tells us this, it's predictable. And that is that if your child isn't getting the response that they're used to getting from tantruming and whining, because you're no longer responding to it in the same way, then they may try to turn up the volume. They might yell a little bit louder, maybe thinking, hey, maybe my mom just hasn't heard me yet, so I'll do it. I'll turn up the volume here. Or maybe I've just got to do this longer because I'm really upset. And there will be some frustration that they'll feel because it's not working anymore. It's not working because you're not going to give them what they want when they're whining. And so what happens is there may be a burst, an increase in the whining and tantruming, what we call a burst of the behavior, an increase in the behavior before it goes extinct, before it dies down, before it goes to zero. So in behavioral science, they call this an extinction burst, which is the child tries harder and harder and harder to try and get your attention through whining and crying because that may have worked in the past. Okay. And what's critical, I'm sure you get the point here. What's critical is that you don't give in as they increase. You don't give in. So make a note for yourself. It might get worse before it gets better. On the screen here, it says get worse and carry on. And that's the carry on part. I just want to share with you right now. The stay calm and carry on, we've talked about stay calm. Carry on means that it's really important that you continue to do what you were doing before the tantrum. I'll give you an example. If you were reading a book and your child came up and said, I want to go outside and play in some way, they taking your hand, pulling it, and you said, hey, you know what? It's 11 o'clock at night. You need to be in bed. We can't go outside and play right now. And they start to tantrum. What's important is when you decide, I'm not going to give in, I'm not going to open the door, I'm not going to compromise and say, well, you can watch TV or I'll come and read you a book. You say, hey, sweetheart, you need to be in bed. We're not going outside right now. I love you very much. But right now it's sleep time. And that then you go back to reading your book. Now, again, I understand they might be tantruming. They might be throwing themselves on the floor and kicking the floor, and they might walk over and grab a book and throw it. But you're going to do your best to not give in. You're going to do your best to stay calm. You're going to do your best to remind yourself, my child is loved, fed, and safe. They're just wanting to go outside, which is okay that they want to go outside. But it's not going to happen right now because it's 11 o'clock at night and it's sleep time. And what you want to do is acknowledge, I hear that you want to go outside. And that's okay, but it's not going to happen right now. It's bedtime. And so I'm going to keep reading my book and you got to go to bed. And it's really important to carry on is that you don't get pulled away from reading your book or whatever you were doing. So the child learns not only that tantruming doesn't get me what I want, but it also doesn't get me lots of attention. Okay? Last point I'd like to make before I share with you just a great opportunity just for the last couple of minutes here. The last point I want to make is I want to define for you what our program and teams mean when we say to ignore a tantrum or not to respond. It's very important. Traditionally, I think when we talk about ignoring, we often, in our society, I think we often mean that you're upset. And so you're trying to make a point to somebody. And the image that comes to my mind is when someone folds their arms and turns their back and says, fine, I'm going to ignore you. I'm going to look this way. Right. And we kind of shut the other person out, but we're doing it to show our displeasure, to say, I'm not happy, kind of like I'm not getting what I want. So I'm going to ignore you. And that's not the kind of ignoring of tantrums that we mean. We don't think that's effective. We also think that that kind of ignoring by being upset or angry and shutting down socially is not what we want to model to autistic children, to any child. We want to teach a child, hey, if you're not getting what you want, it's okay to feel upset, but stay engaged, keep communicating. Let's brainstorm. Let's find alternatives. Let's acknowledge that you want it. But sometimes you simply absolutely just can't go outside at 11 o'clock at night. And so we just have to figure out how to way to stay calm and focus on what we can do, like go to bed. So, but in those cases, when we say to ignore the behavior, we mean to not give the child what they want necessarily, but you can still be understanding and empathic and never hold back love. It's really important, guys. Really, really important. And there's a way to do that. And I gave you the example right off at the beginning, right off the top, of me leaning into the child and saying, hey, you know what? I understand you're missing your mom, and sometimes I'm upset too. I thought that was loving. That was kind. It was empathic. And then in the next sentence, I said, but this door can't open right now. It's not going to open. And then in the next sentence, I said, but I'm going to help you try. So I was really clear. It's like saying, hey, right now, that back door is not going to open for us to go for a walk at midnight or to go out in the yard at 11 o'clock at night, or we're not going to buy the Lego. I want to be really clear. That's not going to happen right now. But I do love you. And I know that you like playing with Lego. And now we're going to school. So there's a way for me to ignore the tantrum, meaning to not give into it, to not give the child what they want, and to not try and distract them or offer them other things and be loving at the same time. So our kind of ignoring really means to not get upset, to not get pulled into the fight, to not feel that your job is to stop your child from crying, but to simply be comfortable and clear and carry on and reinforce when your child decides to stop whining and tantruming. Then you turn to them, then you pay attention, then you offer them things, not what they were wanting, but other things. Okay. So, in conclusion, here's the three things that we talked about. If you can eliminate or prevent the tantrums in the first place, that's a great place to start, but not by appeasing and mind reading your child, but by eliminating hotspots and some other things we talked about. Number two, really promote these alternate ways to communicate. And number three, to stay calm and to carry on. So those are the 3 points.